And I thought we might look at what happens when somebody doesn't achieve their goal. What does the average human being do when they don't achieve their goals? Any thoughts? Give up? Place blame? Indeed. In fact, that's exactly what the average person does. When they're not achieving their goals, they go into a mode called lay blame. You may want to take some notes on this, because we're going to talk about why it is that some people never achieve their goals and how it is that they behave in order not to achieve their goals. My friend James Ryan once said, poor people should give seminars and we should pay them to go along. And by that he meant, if you look at what the average person does, there's some lessons in there under the heading of what not to do. So we can learn from successful people, but we can also look at the behaviour of average people, which tends to create average results. See, most people aren't doing well in life. Create a list of reasons for not doing well. I understand this extremely well. Back in 1989, 1990, as I believe I've mentioned to you, I had my business and life change direction. We had an airline dispute in Australia, and the business, which was very secure, doing extremely well, suddenly was stopped dead in its tracks. Cash flow went to zero, and it was a pretty challenging time. I had to close down all of the branches, and it was very, very challenging. And when I thought it couldn't get worse, guess what? It got worse. Have any of you ever been there when it got worse? You didn't think it could get worse, and it got worse. I started to create this list of reasons for not doing well at the time, as we moved into 1990. And on my list I had those darn airline pilots. How dare they go on strike and want more money? And then it appeared that the airlines had kind of engineered it, so I put them on my list too. I went to my accountant and I said to my accountant, you should have warned me that something like this could happen in my business. You should have given me advice. He said, we discussed insurance and you did nothing. So I put him right there on the top of the list, unsupportive accountant. Right? Do any of you know people who do this? So I had a list of reasons why I wasn't doing well. And the only reason I give you the personal example here is mine's a fairly extreme situation, but salespeople often have a list of reasons for not doing well in sales. They say, well, the reason I'm not doing well is because of the economy right now. It's the economy. Not only that, but it's the competition. It's the customers. Very hard to find good customers. It's the management. It's the products. It's the pricing. It's the marketing. It's the recession. Now, I can't work out whether it's the recession coming or the recession going. But it's the interest rates. It's the banks. Now, I'm sure none of you ever do this, but how many of you know people who do? Not you, but I mean you know people who do, yeah? Is this human nature? Of course it is. This is what we all tend to do to a greater or lesser extent. It's just that I simply understand this process now, and if I catch myself doing this, I put the brakes on. You talk to these people about, so why don't you do something to change your circumstances? I mean, why don't you take some action? And they then come up with justification as to why things cannot possibly change at the present time. In fact, they'll tell you things can't change until the economy improves. The interest rates go down, the government changes, my children grow up, my spouse gets off my back, and they have a list of reasons why things can't change, a list of reasons to justify why things can't change. And if you've got a good enough list, will things change? Well, yes and no. No, they won't get better, but yes, they might change and get worse. Often that's what happens. And I see people at sales conferences one year, and then I'm invited back the next year. I see them again, and we talk about their goals and talk about what they've done. And I often hear this lay blame justification stuff, because they've not really achieved anything in the year. Eventually, people who do this for long enough go into denial. Some people think denial is just a river somewhere in Egypt, but it is much, much more than that. It is dangerous when you go into denial, because when you go into denial, you start to deny that there's any problem here. You start to also deny that you had aspirations to do better and achieve your goals. I've even had some people say to me, in total denial, well, I guess this is simply what God planned for me, this life. Now, it's God's fault. God's on the list. And I don't mean any disrespect. But, that is sad. And finally, these people often quit. Now, they don't quit their job. Maybe it would be better if they did. But they quit growing, trying, making an effort. It's all over. Sadly, I meet some people who have done this in their early 20s. I meet some people who do this when they have their first midlife crisis in their mid-30s. Sometimes meet them again after they've had their second midlife crisis in their 40s. Now, the reason I understand this very, very well is because back there in 1989, 1990, I was going through many of these stages. I certainly didn't reach the point of quitting, but I certainly was in denial, and I certainly had good reasons to justify why things couldn't change. And people who do this tend to live their lives as victims. This is typical victim mentality. In fact, I'll tell you, I'm just a victim of circumstances beyond my control. Now, some of you may have heard me talk about this before. And I was attending a program in 1990 featuring Robert Kiyosaki. Robert wasn't very well known in Australia at that time. He was presenting programs out in Australia from time to time on, well, basically personal development programs. He was presenting one of these in March 1990. I'm sitting in the group, around about 100 people in the room. He writes these two things up on the board. He doesn't go into this, but he just talks about these things, and he says this is how the average person thinks, and this is why they'll never do well until they bust out of this thinking. He said, I'm going to put a word on the board, and this word is understood by very successful people. More than understood, it is lived. They walk the talk here. He said, this word turns it around. If you are unhappy with where you are at in your life, this word will turn it around for you, which is why I'm sharing it with you here now. And the word is what's the word? Responsibility. Where you and I are at in our life right now, we have created. We are responsible. That is my belief. Now, we can debate that. And we can say, well, look, I didn't create that terrible situation for me back there in 1989. It was the airline pilots. However, we all have choices in life. Could I have insured against something like that? Of course. Could I have chosen to be in a different business? Of course. We are where we are at today because of decisions we have made along the way, which brings us to where we are now. Some of us say, well, look, it's my partner's fault, my spouse's fault. Well, we made a choice, we made a decision. And if that relationship hasn't turned out the way we expected it to, we made decisions along the way which maybe created the outcome. Yes? Sometimes very, very hard to take. But what he said is, when you reach the point where you are prepared to take 100% responsibility for where you are at, now you are empowered to move to wherever you would like to be. And I sat in the group and I listened and I looked at that word and I said, yeah, I understand what he's talking about. I can understand how people could do this lay, blame, justify stuff. I can understand that. Losers would do that. I didn't realize he was actually talking about me. Because I had so much personal growth and personal development, and I was in the business of bringing out the American speakers, it didn't occur to me that I had fallen into the trap of being a victim. And I remember the day I took 100% responsibility and essentially said, where I'm at right now, I alone have created, and I alone can fix. And I can only fix it if I take responsibility for where I'm at and then take responsibility for where I would like to be. Because, some people, they say things like, they ought to fix this. They ought to fix this situation with the government. They ought to fix this thing with the interest rates. The company, they ought to fix this thing that's preventing me getting more sales. Well, I don't know whether you've worked it out yet, but they are not coming to fix anything. Have you worked that out? They are not coming. Life is a do-it-for-ourselves project. Most people don't realise that. Most people are blaming other people for where they're at and never ever take responsibility for creating the future that they want. Now, I remember the day I took responsibility. It was pretty tough because I had to face what I had done to create my life at that point.